My husband canceled our honeymoon 1 hour before to go with his mother. I said yes. But I secretly flew to Maui and enjoyed it alone while he searched for me desperately. Now he's divorced and his family is broken. I'm 28 years old. I work in digital marketing, and I swear I never thought I'd be telling this story just a few months after getting married, but here I am, getting divorced from a man who basically treated me like I was his housekeeper instead of his wife. The thing is, I've always been the typical eldest daughter who wants to please everyone. You know, the one who always says yes to everything. The one who doesn't want conflict. The one who'd rather stay quiet than make a scene. And I guess that's why I ended up in this ridiculous situation that I still can't believe actually happened. I met Matthew about 3 years ago. Almost 3.5 years if I'm being exact. At one of those boring business conferences where everyone's there more for the networking than the talks. He worked in finance, was 29 years old, looked good in his suit with his perfect smile, and seemed interested in what I did. Which was refreshing because most guys at those conferences only want to talk about themselves. We started dating shortly after that, and for almost 2 years, everything seemed, I don't know, normal, I guess. He was attentive, took me to nice restaurants, we talked about future plans, and I thought I'd finally found someone I could build something serious with. What should have been a red flag, looking back, was how his family was so present in everything from the beginning. His mother, Linda, would call like 3 times a day. And if Matthew didn't answer immediately, she'd start sending worried messages asking if he was okay, if he'd eaten, if he needed anything. At first I thought it was sweet, like, oh, how nice that he has such a close family. But then I started noticing it wasn't exactly affection she was showing, it was more like control. And Matthew never said no to anything, absolutely anything. If she wanted us to go to dinner on a Friday when we already had plans, well, we'd change our plans. If she had an opinion about what car he should buy, he'd buy that car. I told myself it was temporary, that when we got married, things would change and he'd set boundaries. But spoiler alert, that didn't happen at all. We got engaged after 1.5 years of dating, and from that moment the wedding stopped being our wedding and became Linda's event. She picked the venue, the menu, the flowers. Even my dress had to pass her approval because according to her she had very good taste and I needed her help. I remember my mom, Victoria, asked me several times if I was sure about all this, and I'd tell her yes, that it was just wedding stress, that everything would calm down afterwards. My dad, Charles, was more direct and told me, Olivia, if you're not comfortable with this family, you don't have to get married. But I was so caught up in the role of the perfect bride that I didn't want to listen. The wedding was last June, and it was exactly how Linda wanted it, with all her friends and family taking up like 80% of the guests while my friends and family were basically decoration. But anyway, none of that prepared me for what happened literally 1 hour before we were supposed to leave for the airport heading to our honeymoon in Bali. I already had my suitcase packed. I was excited because we were finally going to have 2 weeks just the two of us, without his family, without interruptions, just enjoying being newlyweds. Matthew came home. I was finishing checking that I had everything in my carry-on bag, and he sat on the couch with that face you make when you're about to say something you know is going to cause problems. He told me, I need to talk to you about the trip. And I thought maybe they'd changed the flight or something like that. But no. What he told me was much worse. Turns out his family, basically Linda and several of her siblings and cousins, including Kimberly, who always looked at me like I was trash, had decided they also wanted to go to Bali and that it would be nice if we all went together. When I say together, I mean they'd booked rooms at the same hotel as us, had changed their flights to go on the same plane, and basically had planned our entire honeymoon to be a family trip. And the part that still makes my blood boil every time I think about it is that Matthew told me, completely calmly, that since they wanted to have quality time together in Bali, it would be better if I stayed home to get the house in order, do deep cleaning, organize all the wedding gifts, wash the clothes we'd accumulated, and basically do all the household chores that, according to him, had piled up because of the wedding craziness. I stood there with my packed suitcase, with my passport in my hand, and all I could think was, is this really happening or am I in a nightmare? I asked him if he was joking, and he said no, that his family was very important to him, and that I had to understand they needed this trip to connect as a family. I said, and what am I? Am I not your family now? And he responded that yes, but that I had to. We'll be understanding and that. Anyway, I didn't like the beach that much, which was an absurd lie, because I grew up going to the beach with my parents all the time. I tried to reason with him, tried to explain that this was our honeymoon, that it was important for us as a couple, but he just kept repeating that his mother had done so much for the wedding that this was the least we could do for her. In that moment, something in my brain just clicked. It wasn't even a conscious decision. It was more like a survival instinct that told me, if you stay here and accept this, this is going to be your life forever. So I told him it was okay, that I'd stay home, and he seemed relieved and gave me a kiss on the forehead before leaving. As soon as I heard his car drive away, I grabbed my phone and looked for the first flight I could take to anywhere that wasn't here. I ended up finding a flight to Maui that left in 5 hours, and I remembered my parents have a vacation home there they almost never use. I called them and quickly explained what had happened, and my mom literally screamed over the phone. He told you what? That you should stay home doing chores while he goes with his family? Olivia, take the keys to the house and go there right now. I drove to the airport like I was being chased, bought the ticket, which was crazy expensive because I got it last minute, and got on that plane feeling half terrified and half euphoric. I turned off my phone as soon as we took off, because I knew Matthew and his family were going to start calling and sending messages as soon as he got to Bali and told Linda I'd agreed to stay. The truth is, those 2 weeks in Maui were the best 2 weeks I'd had in years. I'm not exaggerating. I woke up when I wanted, ate what I felt like, took surfing lessons because I'd always wanted to learn, read like 4 books on the beach, and basically did everything Matthew always said he didn't like to do. It was like I could finally breathe after drowning, without realizing it. Every day that passed, I felt clearer in my mind about what I had to do. I didn't turn on my phone until the last day before coming back, and when I did, I had literally 347 messages, most from Matthew and Linda, but also from Kimberly and other members of his family. The messages started asking where I was, then became more desperate, then angry, and at the end, they were basically insults and demands that I return immediately and apologize for worrying them. There were messages from Linda saying I was a selfish and immature wife, from Kimberly saying she always knew I wasn't good enough for Matthew, and from Matthew saying I'd ruined the honeymoon and his family was very upset with me. I read every message, and instead of feeling guilty or scared, I felt liberated. It was like I could finally see clearly how toxic this dynamic was, how I'd been allowing them to treat me like my feelings and needs didn't matter. I responded with just one message. It was to Matthew, and I told him, I'm fine. I was in Maui, enjoying the honeymoon I deserve to have. I'm coming back tomorrow, but I'm not going back to the house. I'm going to stay with a friend while I decide what to do about this marriage. And after sending that, I turned off my phone again and enjoyed my last night in peace. When I came back, I called my friend Megan, who's one of those friends you've known since college and who always tells you the hard truths even when they hurt. And I told her everything. She literally told me, "Thank God you finally reacted. I've been waiting for months for you to realize how that family treats you." She took me into her apartment without asking questions, made me a strong coffee, and we sat down to plan what I was going to do. I knew I had to confront Matthew eventually, but I needed to be in a safe place and have a plan before doing it. What I didn't expect was for Matthew's family to go as far as going to my parents' house. My mom called me 3 days after I got back. She was obviously upset, and told me that Linda, Kimberly, and like 4 other family members had shown up at her door, demanding to know where I was, and saying they needed to talk to me immediately. My dad, who's the calmest person in the world normally, had to threaten to call the police to get them to leave, and apparently Kimberly screamed in the middle of the street that I was a bad influence, and that they'd raised a daughter who didn't know how to respect her husband. The neighbors came out to see what was happening, and it was a whole scene, and I felt horrible that my parents had to deal with that because of me, although they told me it wasn't my fault at all, and that they would always be on my side. That same day, I decided it was time to call Matthew. I dialed his number and he answered on the first ring. His voice sounded between angry and desperate, and he started yelling at me, asking where I'd been, why I'd disappeared, how I dared to embarrass him with his family. Like that. I let him talk for like 2 minutes without interrupting him, and when he finally ran out of breath to keep yelling, I told him very calmly, "I'm not going to apologize for anything. Your family needs to apologize to me for expecting me to stay home doing cleaning while you all enjoyed my honeymoon. You need to apologize to me for asking me something so ridiculous. And if you can't do that, then this marriage is over." There was silence on the other end, and then Matthew told me I was being dramatic, that he'd just wanted his family to be happy, that I knew how important Linda was to him. I responded, "And what about me? Am I not important to you? Doesn't my happiness count?" And he didn't know what to say. He literally stayed quiet for like 30 seconds until he finally said, "This isn't about you, Olivia. It's about you can't just do what you want without considering others." And that's when I knew without any doubt that I had to divorce him. I hung up the phone and immediately called my parents to tell them I was going to stay with them for a while. I needed to be in a place where I felt safe and supported while going through this whole process, and I knew I couldn't stay at Megan's apartment permanently. My parents welcomed me with open arms, and my mom made me my favorite food that night like she was trying to compensate for all the stress with love and spaghetti with meatballs. Being in my old room, surrounded by photos from when I was a teenager and all my old books, made me feel like I was starting over, but in a good way, like I could finally be myself again. A week after that call with Matthew, something happened that I didn't expect at all. I was at a cafe near my parents' house, working on my laptop because somehow I had to continue with my normal life, when a girl approached me and asked, "Are you Olivia?" I nodded, somewhat confused, and she introduced herself as Pam and told me she needed to talk to me. Turns out Pam was Matthew's ex-girlfriend. They'd been together for like 3 years before he and I met, and she'd seen photos of our wedding on social media because they still had mutual friends. She told me that when she saw I'd married him, she felt the need to warn me but didn't know how to contact me without seeming crazy. And now that she'd heard rumors that things weren't going well between us, she wanted to tell me about her experience. Pam's story was basically identical to mine. Linda had controlled her entire relationship with Matthew, had expected Pam to leave her job so she could be more available for the family, had constantly criticized her clothes, her way of speaking, her friends, everything. Kimberly had been especially cruel to her and had told her to her face that she wasn't good enough for their family. Pam put up with like 2.5 years of that before realizing Matthew was never going to set boundaries with his family. And when she finally broke up with him, Linda and several family members went to Widow, her workplace, and caused a scene saying she'd used Matthew and was a gold digger. Hearing her story was like seeing my future if I'd stayed, and I thanked her for taking the time to find me and tell me all that. With all that clarity and with the support of my parents and friends, I made the decision to start divorce proceedings. I hired a lawyer, Elizabeth Harper, who was known for not being intimidated and for being very direct, and I told her the whole situation. She told me she'd seen similar cases before, that controlling families like Matthew's often try to harass and pressure the other party to give up on the divorce, but that she wasn't going to let that happen. I signed the papers and I felt, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it was like a mix of sadness for the marriage I thought I'd have and relief at getting out of something that clearly was never going to work. Matthew didn't take the news of the divorce papers well. His lawyer contacted me first, trying to negotiate, saying Matthew was willing to go to couples therapy, that we could work on our problems, but I'd already made my decision. I didn't respond to those offers and told Elizabeth to proceed with everything. Linda's messages became more frequent and insistent, now saying I was a bad person for giving up on the marriage so quickly, that divorce was a sin, that I was being influenced by my parents who had never wanted me to marry Matthew, which was completely false because my parents had always supported me in all my decisions until they saw how I was being treated. A month after signing the papers, something happened that still gives me chills when I think about it. One of my best friends since childhood was celebrating her birthday at a nice restaurant downtown. She'd invited like 20 people, and I was happy to be able to go out and distract myself a bit from all the divorce drama. We were in the middle of dinner. I was laughing at something someone had said, when suddenly, Matthew appeared. I don't know how he knew I was going to be there. Maybe he saw something on social media or someone told him, but he came into the restaurant furious looking for me. He saw me at the table and walked directly toward me, and I felt like my heart was going to jump out of my chest. Everyone at the table went quiet, and it was obvious something bad was going to happen. Matthew started yelling at me right there in the middle of the restaurant, saying, "How dare I be having fun while our marriage was falling apart? That surely I was here with some guy I'd met. That's why I'd wanted the divorce in the first place." There was a friend of my birthday friend at the table, a guy I'd met that same night and who I'd talked to about work for like 10 minutes, and Matthew started pointing at him, accusing me of having an affair with him. The guy, who was completely innocent in all this and looked terrified, tried to explain to Matthew that he'd just met me, but Matthew, I didn't want to listen. He tried to get close to him like he was going to hit him, and I had to get between them along with other friends who were at the table. It was a horrible scene, The restaurant manager had to come ask us to leave or they were going to call the police. My friend was crying because her birthday had been ruined, and I was shaking from the adrenaline and fear. Matthew finally left, but not before yelling that this wasn't over, and that he was going to make sure I regretted leaving him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed at my parents' house, obviously. I wasn't going anywhere alone after that scene, and I kept turning over in my head everything that had happened. Matthew had never been violent before, at least not physically. But this version of him scared me. The next morning, I called Elizabeth and told her what had happened, and she recommended I consider a restraining order. But I knew that was only going to make things worse with Linda and the rest of the family. Then I came up with another idea, something that might make them back off without having to involve the police. I called Linda directly. She answered with her sweet fake voice asking how I was, like nothing had happened, and I told her very clearly, Matthew showed up at my friend's birthday last night and caused a violent scene where he tried to attack another guest. If something like that happens again, I'm going to get a restraining order against him. And I'm sure you know what that would mean for his job and finance. There was a long silence, and then Linda told me in a cold voice, You're threatening my son. I responded, No, I'm protecting my safety. Which is something you should have taught your son to respect from the beginning. I don't know exactly what Linda told Matthew after that call, but 3 days later, Elizabeth called me to tell me Matthew had signed the divorce papers without any objection. Apparently, his lawyer had recommended he cooperate because a restraining order really could affect his career, especially working at a finance firm where reputation is everything. We signed all the necessary papers, agreed on a division of assets that was pretty simple because we'd been married less than 3 months and had almost nothing shared, and Elizabeth told me the process would be complete in a few months depending on the court paperwork. Now, like 2 months after all this, I'm in the process of rebuilding my life. I'm still living with my parents while I save for my own place. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my relationship with Matthew, and I've been going to therapy to work on my tendency to please everyone without thinking about my own needs. My therapist told me something that stuck with me. She said, Olivia, you didn't fail at your marriage. You saved yourself from a situation that was only going to get worse. And she's right. Because if I'd accepted staying home that day doing cleaning while Matthew went with his family, I would have set a precedent that it was okay to treat me like that. And I'd probably still be in that marriage being miserable and convincing myself that's just how things were. Last week, Matthew tried to send me a message. It was long and basically said he'd been reflecting and maybe he'd made mistakes, that his family was sometimes too much, but he loved them, and that if I was willing, we could try to fix things. I didn't respond to him. I just forwarded the message to Elizabeth so it would be documented and blocked him on all platforms. There's nothing to fix. Not with someone who thinks it's okay to ask his wife to stay home doing chores while he goes on his honeymoon with his mom. My parents asked me a few days ago if I regretted marrying Matthew, and the truth is, I don't know how to answer that question. On one hand, yes, I regret not having seen the red flags earlier, not having listened to my mom when she asked me if I was sure, having invested 2 years of my life in someone who clearly didn't value me. But on the other hand, if I hadn't gone through all this, maybe I never would have learned to set boundaries for myself, to prioritize my own happiness, to say no when something doesn't feel right. And that lesson, as painful as it was to learn, was worth it. There are still days when I feel sad about the marriage I imagined I'd have, about the version of Matthew I thought was real, but probably never existed. But those days are becoming less frequent, and every day I feel more like myself, more confident about who I am and what I deserve. The other day, I was at the beach with Megan, the same beach where I used to go with my parents when I was a kid, and she asked me if I'd ever consider getting married again in the future. I told her maybe, someday, but only if I find someone who sees me as a priority and not an option. Someone who understands that marriage is about building a life together and not about pleasing your family at the expense of your partner. For now, I'm focused on myself, on my job that I love and that I'd neglected because Matthew always wanted me to be available for his family, on my friendships that held me up when I needed them most, on my relationship with my parents who showed me what real unconditional love is. The divorce isn't officially finalized yet, but it doesn't matter that much anymore, because emotionally, I already closed that chapter a while ago. And most importantly, I learned that going on my honeymoon alone to Maui was the best decision I could have made, because it gave me the space and clarity to realize I deserved much more than what Matthew and his family were willing to give me.